The testimony of the former addict.
Do you believe in hell? Not just as an idea or metaphor, but as a real place, full of unimaginable torment. Today, you will hear a testimony that could forever change the way you see life, death, and what happens after it. This is not just a story of overcoming. It is a vivid account, a supernatural experience that reveals the depths of darkness and the power of divine light. Imagine being dragged into an endless abyss where the fire does not consume, but tortures, where screams of pain echo without ceasing, souls cry out for mercy, and there is no hope of escape. This is the scenario that was shown to a woman who, lost in addiction, saw her life being destroyed little by little until the moment when everything changed. She entered a spiritual world that few would even dare to imagine, and came back with revelations that could profoundly impact her life. Have you ever thought about how simple, seemingly harmless choices can open doors to eternal damnation? Pride, lies, lack of forgiveness, habits that seem insignificant? Each of these steps can lead to something much bigger than we imagine, and that's what she witnessed. During this journey to hell, spiritual truths were revealed, showing how the enemy uses traps to capture lives and keep them from salvation. With every step into that place of torment, she saw demons manipulating people, stifling hope and magnifying suffering. There were rivers of fire, but the heat wasn't the worst. The darkness was palpable, a presence that seemed to devour any trace of soul. Indescribable sounds, screams, cries, and murmurs of despair filled the environment. It was not a distant or fictitious place. It was real as you're breathing right now. And you? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to face your worst fears and discover that they are just the beginning? Many believe that hell is an invention to scare, something used to manipulate or indoctrinate. But what if it's exactly the opposite? What if hell is a warning, a call to reflection, so that we can change the course of our lives? This woman not only saw this place, but experienced in her soul the weight of being there. The most stunning revelation, however, was not what she saw in hell, but what happened at the moment when there seemed to be no way out. A voice cut through the chaos. A powerful presence emerged, bringing with it a light that dispelled the darkness. It was at that moment that a greater truth was revealed. No matter how lost someone is, there is always a chance for redemption. This testimony is not about fear. It's about awakening. It's about realizing how vulnerable we are and how our choices can take us closer or further from the divine light. It's an invitation to look inside yourself and reflect on what really matters before it's too late. Now I ask you, are you prepared to know what she discovered? To hear about what really happens in hell and how these revelations can impact not only your life, but also your eternal destiny? What you are about to hear is not a simple story. It is a call, an alert, an opportunity to see the invisible and understand that, even in the deepest darkness, there is a light capable of rescuing any soul willing to be transformed. This story is not just to be heard, but to move us to action. What was revealed to this woman shows how powerful and essential prayer is in our lives. When we pray, we create a direct bridge with God, a connection capable of transforming impossible situations, bringing light to the darkest moments, and protecting us against the enemy's traps. I want to invite you to be part of this spiritual journey. Leave your prayer request in the comments. It could be for you, for a family member, for a friend, or even for something you have close to your heart. Let's unite our faith and pray together, because when we come before God in prayer, miracles happen. If you believe that this testimony and message can impact other people's lives, like and share this video. This helps reach more people who need to hear about the power of prayer and the spiritual truths we are revealing here. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories and revelations we have to share. Prayer has power. Let's pray together, because God has great plans for your life. Life before addiction. She had dreams. Like anyone else, I imagined a future full of possibilities, full of happiness and achievements. Childhood had been simple, but filled with an innocent faith, learned through silent prayers and stories told by elders about the power of God. His adolescence was marked by a growing curiosity about the world, but also by internal questions that began to erode the basis of that faith that previously seemed unshakable. Little by little, she moved away from what had always given meaning to her life, driven by a desire for freedom that, at the time, seemed like the right path. Her life began to change when, at a young age, she was confronted with the raw reality of the world. The disappointments came, one after another, like uncontrollable waves that shook the few certainties she still had. Friendships seemed empty, childhood dreams distant, and the faith that had once been her foundation began to seem like something outdated. like a piece of her history that she wanted to forget. God doesn't need me, she thought. And maybe I don't need him either. It was in this void that the seeds of what was to come began to be planted. Temptations arrived disguised as freedom. First, there were small concessions, innocent parties, a sip of drink here, another there, just to feel like you belong. Then came bolder choices, always justified by an inner voice that whispered, "You deserve to live life to the fullest." She never thought that these small decisions could open doors to something much bigger and more dangerous. After all, no one thinks. When we are immersed in the search for pleasure or momentary satisfaction, we do not see the invisible traps that form around us. Little by little, she began to realize that something was missing. It wasn't something that friends or parties could fill, but a deep feeling of emptiness that was growing in his chest. Even at her highest moments, when everything seemed perfect, there was a hole inside her that never went away. She tried to fill it with more fun, more adrenaline, more experiences, but everything seemed to just push her further away from herself, and without realizing it, also from God. There were moments of reflection, rare but intense. Sometimes, as she stared at her bedroom ceiling one silent dawn, she wondered if she had taken the wrong path. At these times, memories of old prayers, those words whispered as a child, returned to his mind like a distant echo. But she refused to listen. That's nonsense. I have everything I need right here, in the now. And then, as if to quell that restlessness, he delved deeper into the lifestyle he chose. But her life wasn't all darkness during this period. There were moments of happiness, or at least what felt like happiness. She clung to this as justification to continue, to ignore that inner voice that sometimes screamed for help. Her friends considered her the life of the party, that person who always knew how to liven up the atmosphere and bring a smile to everyone. But no one saw what happened when the lights went out, when the music stopped and she walked home alone. No one knew about the constant struggle inside her, the invisible battle that was beginning to consume her soul. Behind her smiles and apparent confidence, she hid a pain that she could barely explain. I felt like something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. And then came the first signs that what she thought was freedom had, in fact, turned into a weight she couldn't carry. Sleepless nights became more frequent. The choices that once seemed liberating now felt like prisons. But she didn't know how to escape. Looking back, she admits the signs were all there. But in the heat of the moment, she just didn't want to see them. It was easier to blame the world, life, or even God, than to face the fact that she herself was moving away from what was good, true, and eternal. And that's what makes this story so real, so close to each of us. Who has never ignored signs? Who has never made decisions that, deep down, they knew would lead to a dark place? Her life before addiction was marked by seemingly small choices, but which opened the door to much greater consequences. But like her, many of us believe we are in control, that we can stop whenever we want, that there are no consequences for what we do, until reality comes as a blow, and we realize that we are no longer masters of ourselves. If you've ever been through something similar, you know exactly what I'm saying. And if you know someone who is on this path, you know how difficult it is to watch the ruin without being able to do anything. Maybe you felt that same emptiness, that same lack of meaning that she felt. Maybe you've already made choices that opened doors that now seem impossible to close. Comment here if you've been through something like this, or know someone who's been through a similar situation. Maybe it's time to share your story too. Write words like faith, freedom, or even redemption. And let's start a conversation about how this can all change. The path to darkness. Her transition from a seemingly normal life to an abyss of darkness didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process, like quicksand that pulled her deeper and deeper with each movement. At first, she felt in control, as if each choice was just a little adventure, a step towards something more exciting. But, little by little, these decisions began to steal parts of her essence, turning off that light that still shined within her. It all started with what seemed harmless. The parties continued, and the casual use of substances that promised fun and escape became part of the routine. It was as if the temporary euphoria offered by these moments was the only way to fill the emptiness she carried. She thought she had control over it, that she could stop whenever she wanted, that it would never dominate her. But what seemed like temporary relief for his weary soul began to turn into a heavy, invisible, unbreakable chain. She didn't see the trap being set around her. Friends who were once just companions for laughter and fun began to bring influences that seemed harmless at first, but carried a deep darkness. It was always a step beyond the limit, Always something that made her heart torn between the emotion of the moment and the echo of a voice that whispered that she was walking away from everything that really mattered. This voice, however, became weaker with each wrong choice, and she, without realizing it, walked away from what once anchored her. Addiction did not enter his life suddenly. He came sneakily, hidden in the small concessions she made every day. First, they were moments that she justified as deserved. Then came the excuses. Just today, just this once, just because I need to forget. And before he knew it, what was just once had turned into a pattern, and the pattern had become a way of life. And at that point, she no longer knew how to go back. The consequences began to appear like increasingly dense shadows in his life. First came the small signs: sleepless nights, financial problems that seemed to have no solution, relationships that were fraying without her understanding exactly why. But instead of stopping and reflecting, she sank even deeper, seeking relief in the same place that brought her destruction. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Looking back, she realizes that the traps were much bigger than she imagined. It wasn't just bad choices or an unruly lifestyle. They were spiritual forces that took advantage of her vulnerability to keep her trapped. And when you're stuck like that, the world seems to change. Joy turns into anguish, peace into anxiety, and what once seemed like freedom turns out to be a prison. She began to move further away from the people she loved. Addiction brings shame, and shame led to isolation. She felt unworthy of being loved, of receiving help, and this feeling was reinforced by a voice in her head that said, "You don't deserve any of this. You are a failure." This was the same voice that, at the same time, encouraged her to continue in that destructive cycle, saying that there was no way out, that it was too late to change. The darkness that enveloped her was not just emotional or physical, it was spiritual. There were moments when she felt a presence, something dark and oppressive, as if an invisible force was feeding on her pain. She tried to ignore it, trying to rationalize it, but deep down, she knew there was something more. There was something that went beyond what the eyes could see. What she didn't realize at that moment was that each wrong choice took her closer to a destiny that no one would want to face. She was unknowingly opening spiritual doors that allowed evil forces to gain access to her life. These forces, which previously seemed like movie stories or horror stories, now became real, tangible. It was as if each wrong decision was a key, unlocking gates that should have remained closed. And even with all of this, there were times when something inside her still struggled. A small spark of hope, buried beneath layers of guilt, pain, and fear, tried to shine through. But she ignored it, telling herself that she was already too far gone, that there was no going back. It was a lie she believed, and it kept her trapped in the cycle of destruction. Have you ever felt this way? Like you were trapped in something that seemed impossible to escape? Maybe you know someone who is right now, fighting against currents they can't see. Comment here if you've been through something similar or know someone who needs to hear this. Write words like hope, liberation, or light to show that there is still a way out because, like her, we can all find a way back. The moment of total ruin. Rock bottom arrived in a way she could never have imagined. Everything that seemed manageable collapsed like a sandcastle hit by a violent wave. The downward spiral that had been brewing for so long swallowed her completely, and there was no longer any way to pretend she was okay. The consequences of the choices she had been making began to manifest themselves in every aspect of her life. That feeling of emptiness that she tried to fill with parties, addictions, and shallow friendships turned into an internal abyss. The mask she wore to the world could no longer hide the pain that consumed her. Financially, everything was falling apart. Expenses were piling up like an avalanche, and she simply couldn't cope. Promises of work and opportunities evaporated because his mind was no longer focused, and his priorities were distorted. It was as if everything around her was slowly imploding, but she didn't know how to stop the disaster. Each attempt to start over seemed to be another step towards destruction. Each temporary solution brought new, deeper, and more devastating problems. Emotionally, she was in pieces. That person who once believed in dreams, in love, and even in their own ability to achieve something good, no longer existed. The mirror showed an empty face, dull, lifeless. The tears she shed alone in the dark of her room were like a cry for help that no one could hear. It was difficult to even look at herself without feeling ashamed. She felt like she had become unrecognizable, a broken and irreparable version of what she once was. Relationships were also falling apart. True friends were no longer around, driven away by the lies and broken promises she left behind. Those who remained were just shadows of what she thought was friendship. People who, like her, were trapped in their own addictions, and escapes from reality. The family, who had tried to reach out so many times, no longer knew how to reach her. To them, it was as if she was drowning in a sea of bad choices, but rejecting all rescue boats. Spiritually, she was in limbo. The childhood prayers, the stories about faith and redemption that once touched his heart, seemed like memories of a life that was no longer his. God, for her, was a distant idea, almost a myth. Not because she had stopped believing completely, but because she felt that he couldn't look at someone so lost, so dirty, so broken. She believed that her choices had permanently separated her, as if there was no longer any forgiveness or chance of redemption for someone like her. The nights became a constant nightmare. She would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, with an inexplicable feeling that she was being watched. The room seemed to be filled with a dense, heavy darkness that suffocated her. There were moments when she felt a presence, something evil and oppressive, but she didn't have the strength to face it. The feeling that there was something or someone trying to drag her to an even darker place was constant. And deep down, she knew it was a reflection of all the doors she had opened with her choices. Things started to get even worse, as darker thoughts started to invade his mind. Maybe the world would be better without me, she thought. Maybe this pain will end if I just disappear. These thoughts haunted her, and she felt like she was on the edge of an abyss from which she would not be able to return. But even in those moments, there was a small, almost extinguished flame that whispered to her that this couldn't be the end. This flame was so fragile that she often ignored it, but it was there, resisting, trying to guide her back to the light. There was one night in particular that marked the lowest point of his life. She was alone, surrounded by empty bottles, her head spinning and her heart heavy. At that moment, while looking at the ceiling, something changed. It was not a dramatic change or an instantaneous divine revelation. It was more like a thought, a question that arose in his mind. If I'm so close to the end, is there still a beginning for me? She wasn't sure where that question came from, but it was enough to make something inside her stir. That moment wasn't the end of his pain, but it was the beginning of something different. It was as if life was waiting for her to recognize her own ruin so she could begin to rebuild it. But that night, she was still surrounded by darkness. I still felt the weight of every wrong choice, of every open door that now seemed impossible to close. She was still trapped, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe there could be a way out. Have you ever felt like you've reached your limit, that there's nowhere left to go? Have you ever found yourself in a place so dark that it seemed like there was no light anywhere? If this story is resonating with you, or if you know someone who needs to hear this, comment here. Write, "There is still hope," or "The light can win." Because sometimes, the simple choice to believe in a way out can be the first step towards finding it. Let's talk about this, because you are not alone, and there is so much more to this story that needs to be told. The supernatural experience in hell. That night, when despair seemed to be at its peak, and every dark thought threatened to consume her, something unexpected happened. She wasn't sleeping, but she wasn't fully conscious either. It was as if his mind and body had been transported to another place, a place that felt as real as the physical world but infinitely more oppressive. At first, everything was a dense void, a silence so deep that it hurt your ears, as if even sound had been devoured by that space. However, soon that void was filled by an indescribable sensation, something heavy, dark, and completely contrary to anything she had ever felt before. The heat came first. It wasn't like the heat of an ordinary fire, but something that seemed to come from within, as if it was being consumed from the inside out. As she looked around, she realized that there was no floor, no walls, nor a horizon that she could see. There was just an endless expanse, filled with a pulsating red glow, like boiling lava. However, it was more than that. It was a place that seemed to be alive, breathing, moving in a way that made it impossible to ignore that there was something or someone there with her. Then, the sounds started. At first, they were like whispers, disjointed words that she couldn't understand. But they soon turned into screams, wails so desperate they made his soul shudder. These sounds were not coming from a distant place. They were all around her, everywhere, as if they were inside her. It was the sound of people crying out, begging for mercy, but with a certainty in their voices that that mercy would never come. The pain that accompanied those screams was almost tangible, and she knew with every part of her being that these were not just imaginary sounds. This was real. It was then that she saw the first figures, distorted silhouettes, erased by intense heat, moving erratically. They weren't human, or at least they didn't appear to be. Some were crawling, while others seemed to be trapped in something invisible, struggling to escape. But there was something even more terrifying. She felt, before she saw, the presence of larger, darker beings who seemed to be watching from afar. When he finally managed to discern one of them, his heart almost stopped. It was an immense figure, with eyes glowing like hot coals, that looked at her with an expression of pure contempt, as if she were nothing more than easy prey. The proximity of these beings brought a feeling of fear that she had never experienced before. It wasn't the kind of fear that paralyzes you, but something that seemed to tear your soul to pieces. They didn't need to talk. Their presence was enough to convey a clear message. She was in a place where there was no hope, no way out, and no trace of kindness. This was a domain where everything good had been erased, replaced by pain and darkness. As she tried to move, she realized her feet were stuck. There were no visible chains, but it was as if the environment itself was holding her, as if the place knew she was there and had no intention of letting her go. It was at that moment that something pulled her, like an invisible force that was dragging her deeper into that abyss. Everything around began to spin, and the screams became louder, closer. She tried to scream too, but her voice seemed to disappear in the chaos. Suddenly, she found herself facing a river of fire. It wasn't like the rivers we know, with gently flowing waters. This one was violent, bubbling, full of human figures writhing in agony, as if they were being repeatedly consumed by flames. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. It was as if that place was forcing her to see, to witness every detail, to feel the pain and despair that permeated that scene. A voice, low and frightening, echoed around him. It wasn't a voice she could identify as male or female, but something much worse. It was as if the place itself was speaking. "You belong to us," the voice said, and those words rang through his mind like a sentence. Panic gripped her, and for the first time she realized that this was not just a place of physical torment, but also of eternal damnation. Every time she tried to move away, she seemed to be pulled closer to the shadowy figures surrounding her. The burning eyes of that gigantic being pierced her, as if they could see every part of her soul, every mistake, every weakness. And it was at that moment that she realized something even more terrible. She was there because her choices had led her to that place. The doors she opened, the paths she took, everything had contributed to her being dragged into that horror scene. Can you imagine a place where there is no forgiveness, where all that is left is pain and regret? Think for a moment about what this means. Write here in the comments if you've ever felt like you were in such deep darkness that there seemed to be no way out. Write redemption or light, because there is so much more to this story to be told, and what comes next could change the way you see your life. Spiritual truths revealed. In the midst of that scenario of torment and despair, something began to happen. It wasn't a sudden change, but a weight slowly building up inside her. It wasn't just the fear of what I saw around me, but an overwhelming awareness that every scream, every tear, and every shadow in that place had a story, an origin that seemed to reflect something much larger. It was then that she realized none of this was an accident. The hell she witnessed was the result of choices, of paths taken by people who, like her, had ignored signs, avoided truths, and followed shortcuts that seemed easier, but which, in reality, led straight to damnation. As I remained paralyzed in that place, new visions began to emerge. She saw scenes, as if she were being transported to specific moments in the lives of some of the souls present there. They were not vague or blurred memories, but clear, detailed images that showed the mistakes, the falls, and the choices that led them there. A man who had built his life on lies and manipulation, a woman who harbored a pride that blinded her to any need for forgiveness, young people who sought pleasure and power without caring about the consequences for themselves or others. Each story was a reflection of the traps that the world places before us all, and that we often accept without question. With each vision, a truth was revealed with almost painful clarity. It wasn't just about the deeds these people had committed, but about the spiritual doors they had opened. Pride, greed, lust, envy, hatred, and so many other behaviors that the world has normalized, but which carry real spiritual weight. Small, seemingly harmless decisions turned into chains that dragged those souls towards a destiny they believed they would never face. And the scariest part was that it all started subtly. There was no precipitous drop or single moment that marked the beginning of the end. It was a series of compromises, small choices that seemed harmless until it was too late. She began to understand that hell was not just a place of physical torment, but a state of complete separation from the presence of God. And that was the real pain. the total absence of hope, light, or kindness. Those who were there not only suffered from the choices they had made, but also from the knowledge that they had rejected all chances to repent and change. It was an endless cycle of regret and guilt that consumed them from the inside out. It was at that moment that a new revelation came, something that hit her like a bolt of lightning. Just as those people had ignored signs and made bad decisions, she too was walking a similar path. It wasn't something she wanted to admit, but the truth was undeniable. Her addictions, her escapes, her denial of God, everything was leading her in the same direction. Every door she had opened was an invitation to the same fate she now witnessed. But it wasn't just the fear of hell that impacted her. What marked her most was understanding how the world is full of distractions and lies that keep us away from the truth. She saw how the enemy uses everything around us to deceive us. Social media, money, vanity, toxic relationships. Everything can be turned into a trap. Small habits that seem harmless can disconnect us from what really matters. And the more distracted we are, the easier it is to ignore the signs God sends us. Despite the despair she felt, there was something inside her that was beginning to awaken. With each vision, she realized that there was still a chance, a small opening for everything to be different. She knew she couldn't change what had happened to those souls, but she also knew that her own story was not yet completely written. There was something she needed to understand, something that would lead her back to the right path. As these spiritual truths were revealed, she began to feel a different presence. It wasn't like the oppressive shadows and figures that surrounded her. It was something lighter, but also powerful. A voice began to echo inside her, not as an external sound, but as a certainty that came from within. You have a choice. There is still time. These words were not only a relief, but also a warning. It was as if she was being called back, not just to escape that place, but to share what she had seen and experienced. In that moment, she realized that the choices we make daily are not just about ourselves. They have a spiritual impact, a weight that goes far beyond what we can understand. Every attitude, every thought, every word spoken or not said, all of this contributes to shaping our destiny. And most of all, she understood that the only way to break this cycle was through true repentance and a real connection with God. Have you ever stopped to think about the small choices you make every day? Have you ever felt that something seemingly harmless can have a much greater impact than you imagine? Write here in the comments if you have ever noticed the traps that exist around you. Use the words truth or revelation to share your reflection, because there is so much more to this story that needs to be told. And what comes next is something that could transform the way you see your life. Divine intervention. At the height of her despair, when everything around her seemed to conspire to crush her under the weight of condemnation and guilt, something changed. She was at the bottom of the abyss, feeling completely helpless, and it was at that moment that something indescribable happened. In the midst of the oppressive darkness, a light began to emerge. At first, it was just a small, barely noticeable dot, like a distant star on a moonless night. But, little by little, that light began to grow, gaining strength, until it became so bright that everything around it seemed to lose its shape. She tried to look away, because that light was unlike any other she had ever seen. Not only was it bright, but it carried with it a feeling of warmth and peace that she had never experienced before. It was not like the fire that surrounded her in hell, which consumed and destroyed. It was a light that seemed to heal and restore. When she finally managed to look directly at that presence, something inside her changed. The fear that dominated her mind began to give way, giving way to a feeling she couldn't describe, but that felt deeply familiar, as if a part of her knew that that light had always been there, waiting for her. Then the voice came. It was not like the oppressive and distorted voices she had heard until now, but a voice that carried authority and compassion at the same time. It was firm, but full of love, as if every word was capable of penetrating directly into her soul. "You were not created for this place," said the voice, and those words echoed within her with a force that made her fall to her knees. It was as if a truth she had always known but ignored had finally been revealed in an undeniable way. She tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. All she could do was cry, because in that moment, she realized the depth of her mistakes and how far she had strayed from everything that was good, pure, and true. But at the same time, she felt something she had never felt before. Hope. That voice was not there to condemn her, but to call her back, to rescue her from what seemed like an inevitable fate. The surrounding light began to expand, pushing the darkness away. The shadowy figures that had previously surrounded her began to retreat, as if that presence was something they could not bear. Even the screams and wails that echoed throughout the place began to disappear, replaced by a silence that seemed holy. She felt like she was being enveloped by that light, like every part of her soul was being touched and healed. The voice spoke again, this time with an urgency she couldn't ignore. You have been called to something greater. This place is not your destiny, but you must choose. What will you do with the chance you are given now? These words hit her like thunder, and she realized that she was facing a decision that would change not just that moment, but her entire existence. It was as if a path was being opened before her, but it was up to her to decide whether she would take the necessary step to follow it. The presence that surrounded her began to bring back memories from her life, moments that she had forgotten or chosen to ignore. She saw scenes from her childhood, when she still prayed with faith and believed that God was on her side. She remembered the times she felt his presence but chose to turn away, and the countless occasions when signs were sent to call her back but she ignored them. Each memory was an invitation to reflection, a reminder that, despite everything, God had never given up on her. However, it wasn't just the past that she saw. The light also showed what his future could be if he chose to accept that calling. It was a future unlike anything she had experienced before, a future where the darkness that surrounded her would be replaced by purpose, where her pain would be turned into testimony and her story into a message of hope for others. But there was a clear warning. That path would not be easy. There would be challenges, struggles, and moments of doubt. Still, the choice was before her, clear as day. She realized that the divine presence was not only there to rescue her, but to show that redemption is a gift offered to all who are willing to accept it. It didn't matter how far she had gone or how deep the wounds she carried, there was a way back, and this moment was his chance to walk that path. The light began to envelop her completely, and she felt as if she were being lifted, as if the invisible chains that bound her had been broken. For the first time in a long time, she felt freedom. Not a temporary freedom, but something that came from within. A liberation that reached the deepest parts of his soul. Have you ever felt like you were trapped by something bigger than yourself? Something that seemed impossible to overcome? Have you ever had a moment when you felt like a voice was calling you, offering you a second chance? Comment here if you've experienced something like this, or if you believe there is a greater purpose for your life. Write "I choose the light" or redemption, because this is how we begin to take the first step towards transformation. And what comes next is the continuation of a journey that needs to be shared. The transformation. After the return. When she opened her eyes, she could still feel the warmth of that light. The feeling of being surrounded by something bigger, more powerful, and infinitely good still pulsed in her soul. But now she was back in the world she knew, the reality she had left behind when she was taken to that supernatural experience. The difference was that everything looked different. The darkness that once hung over her like a constant shadow was no longer there. There was a clarity, an understanding that she had never experienced before. And with that clarity came a weight, but not the kind of weight that paralyzes, but the kind that motivates. It was the weight of knowing that his life had been spared for a purpose. The first few days after his experience were marked by an internal struggle. Although she felt a spiritual rebirth, there was a part of her that was still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She wondered how she could share something so profound, so out of the ordinary, with other people. Who would believe her? Who would understand what it was like to be on the brink of eternal destruction and be rescued by divine intervention? But at the same time, she knew that remaining silent was not an option. The call he felt during that supernatural moment still echoed in his mind, like an order that could not be ignored. The world around her hadn't changed, but she had. The addictions that previously dominated his life now seemed like something distant, as if they were part of a story that no longer belonged to him. The desires that once consumed her have completely lost their meaning. She looked at everything with new eyes, seeing not only the mistakes she made, but also the traps that were around her. Every decision that once seemed trivial was now charged with meaning because she knew what was at stake. The friends who used to accompany her in her old life found her change strange. They didn't understand why she no longer wanted to go out to the same places, or why she avoided the same conversations. Some even tried to get her back to her old lifestyle, saying things like, "It's just one night. You need to relax." But she knew she couldn't play around with those choices anymore. That voice, that presence, was still with her, guiding her, strengthening her, reminding her that every step she took now was important. It was during this period of transformation that she began to seek answers, and above all, a connection with God. Prayers, which before seemed like empty words, were now like deep and sincere conversations. She cried, gave thanks, asked for strength and direction, and with each prayer she felt as if she were being rebuilt from within. The Bible, which had been set aside for so long, became a source of answers, comfort, and wisdom. Each verse she read seemed to speak directly to her, confirming what she had experienced and showing the path she needed to follow. But the transformation was not easy. The journey of redemption is marked by challenges, moments of doubt, and the constant confrontation of the past. There were days when memories of her old life haunted her, whispering that she wasn't worthy of that second chance, that her flaws were too great to be forgiven. At these times, she felt the spiritual battle intensely, as if the enemy was trying to pull her back into the darkness. However, now she knew how to fight. She knew she wasn't alone. It was then that she realized her story wasn't just about her. Everything he had experienced, all the struggles, pain, and overcoming, had a much greater purpose than his own redemption. It was a testimony, a message to those still trapped in the same cycle that almost destroyed her. She began sharing her story with those close to her, not because she felt comfortable reliving those moments, but because she knew she needed to. With each report, he realized the impact his words had. People identified, cried, and some even made the decision to change their own lives. Her transformation was not just spiritual, but also emotional and physical. She began to care for herself in a way she had never done before, recognizing that her body and her life were gifts that needed to be valued. She started to make conscious choices, eliminating everything that could put her at risk again, be it people, places, or habits. Each decision was guided by a single goal: to remain steadfast on the path that had been revealed to her. The changes in his life began to attract attention. People who were previously uninterested in his story now sought to understand what had happened. There was something different about her, a peace that was visible, a light that couldn't be ignored. Even those who previously criticized her began to respect her transformation. But the most important thing for her was not the opinion of others, but the certainty that she was fulfilling the purpose that God had placed in her life. Have you ever felt like your life was in shambles, but that something bigger was trying to pull you back? Have you ever gone through a transformation that seemed impossible in the eyes of others? Share your experience in the comments. Write transformation, or I chose to change, because your story can inspire others, just as this one will inspire so many more. And remember, what comes next is the next step on this journey that is not over yet. The alert, the power of prayer in liberation. During her transformational journey, she realized something she had neglected for so long: the power of prayer. It was not just a religious practice or a simple repetition of words, but a direct connection with something much greater, an invisible link between heaven and earth that has the ability to change the impossible. It was prayer that opened the doors to her deliverance, even when she didn't know she needed to be rescued. At that moment, when divine light intervened and broke the spiritual chains that imprisoned her, she understood that prayer was the key that had allowed that to happen. What she didn't understand before, and what was now so clear, is that prayer is not just a cry for help in times of despair, but a way to align your soul with God's will. It was through this spiritual connection that she began to notice the traps that had been placed in her path and how they camouflaged themselves under the appearance of harmless things. Addictions, disordered desires, wrong choices. All of this was fueled by a distance from God. And when she began to truly pray, not just with words but with sincerity and humility, the change became evident. She came to understand that prayer is a powerful spiritual weapon, capable of breaking down barriers that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Those moments when he knelt and poured out his soul before God became his refuge and his strength. It was in these moments that she felt the strength to resist the temptations that once dominated her, to fight the dark thoughts that still tried to whisper that she wasn't good enough. With each prayer, it was as if a new layer of darkness was removed from his life, allowing more light to enter. However, prayer was not just for herself. She understood that the power of prayer also lay in interceding for others, in using her own experience to help those who were trapped in the same cycles of destruction that nearly consumed her. She began to pray for her friends, her family, and even those who had turned away from her during her worst moments. And the most surprising thing was realizing that his prayers started to make a difference. People who previously seemed completely lost began to seek help, to ask questions, to open up to something they previously rejected. But she knew this struggle wasn't just emotional or psychological. It was a spiritual battle. There were forces that didn't want her to be free, that didn't want her to use her story to reach other people. And that's when she realized that prayer was not just a tool for communicating with God, but also a war strategy against these forces. She remembered the words of the Bible that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. Each prayer was a declaration that she was no longer willing to be dominated by darkness, but that she chose daily to walk in the light. There were times, however, when prayer seemed difficult. Some days, she felt like her words were reaching the ceiling, as if she were speaking to a void. But in those moments, she learned to persevere. It was in these periods of silence that she realized that prayer is not about how we feel, but about the faith we have that God is listening, even when everything around us seems to say otherwise. This perseverance was what kept her going, even on the most difficult days. And it was what led her to understand that liberation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. The power of prayer also brought clarity about what really mattered. She began to see the world in a completely different way. Before, life's distractions, money, status, toxic relationships were all she pursued. But now those things seemed small, insignificant in the face of eternity. Prayer taught her to value what is eternal, to seek what cannot be taken away from her. And it completely changed the way she lived. She began to encourage other people to pray too, because she knew that it was there, in that moment of surrender, that the biggest changes happened. No matter where they were or how lost they felt, prayer was the starting point for real transformation. She said, "If you feel like you're alone, pray. If you feel like no one understands you, pray. And if you don't even know how to start, just say, 'God, I need you,' because He will hear you, even when you think no one else is listening." Have you ever stopped to think about how much prayer can change your life? Have you ever felt like there is something bigger, just waiting for you to open your heart? If you believe that prayer has power, write here in the comments, "I choose to pray," or "Prayer transforms," because when we share our experiences and declarations of faith, we encourage each other to keep fighting. And there is still much more to be told about how she used this spiritual weapon to face challenges that lay ahead. Reflection and alert to the public. As she progressed on her journey of transformation, she couldn't help but reflect on what she had experienced and the impact it could have on other people's lives. Every memory of the hell he witnessed, every scream he heard, every revelation he received, was like an echo that could not be ignored. It was as if his soul was being constantly reminded of the responsibility he now carried. This was not just about her own redemption, but a call to warn those who were still trapped in the same chains that almost dragged her to a final destination of eternal suffering. She began to realize that many people, just like her before her experience, live without being aware of the choices they make on a daily basis. Small decisions that seem insignificant, but carry enormous spiritual weight. The constant search for immediate satisfaction, whether through momentary pleasures, excessive ambitions, or empty relationships, ends up blinding people to the real consequences of their actions. The world is full of distractions that promise happiness, but in reality, take us away from everything that really matters. And that was exactly what she needed to share. His warning was not about fear, but about awakening. She understood that talking about hell, damnation, and spiritual battle was not easy, but it was necessary. People need to know that there is something at stake, something much bigger than we can see. Every choice, every thought, every behavior has an impact on the spiritual world, even if we cannot see it directly. And that's exactly where the danger lies. What we don't see, we often underestimate. She began to reflect on how so many people live as if they had all the time in the world, putting off changes, regrets, and important decisions as if tomorrow was guaranteed. But the truth she experienced so viscerally is that tomorrow is not certain for anyone. The time we have here is limited, and what we do with it has eternal consequences. It was this urgency that motivated her to share her story, even though she knew that many would doubt or even ridicule her. It didn't matter. She knew that if her message reached even one person, it would have been worth it. As he reflected on his own life before that experience, he realized how much he had ignored the signs that God was constantly sending. Little warnings, moments when I could feel something was wrong but chose to ignore it. Now she knew that those signs were divine attempts to rescue her before it was too late. It got her thinking, how many people are living exactly like this right now? How many are blinded by the distractions of the world, thinking they are in control, when in fact they are moving closer and closer to the abyss? She also came to understand something deeply spiritual. Hell is not just a physical place, but also a state of total separation from God. This separation begins here, when we choose to distance ourselves from what is good, pure, and true. Every time we let pride dominate our hearts, every time we allow anger and hatred to grow, every time we give in to selfishness and vanity, we are moving away from God. And this separation, when not interrupted, can turn into something eternal. That's why she decided to make this alert a central part of her mission. Not because I wanted to scare, but because I wanted people to know that there is a way out, a chance to change the course of their lives before it's too late. She knew it wasn't about perfection, but about intention. It was about taking the first step toward God, recognizing that we need His grace and His guidance. This reflection also brought to light the importance of being aware of the subtle traps that the enemy places in our paths. These pitfalls are not always obvious. Often they come disguised as good things, but deep down, they distance us from God. Excessive ambition, the obsession with validation on social media, the search for pleasure at any cost, all of this may seem harmless at first, but it has the power to trap us in ways we don't even realize. And that's exactly what she saw in hell. People who opened doors without knowing it, and who now lived the consequences of those choices. She wanted people to understand that God doesn't want this for anyone. His supernatural experience clearly showed that God's heart is one of love and mercy, but that He also gives us free will to choose our paths. Each of us has the chance to change, to start over, to seek the light before it is too late. But this choice needs to be made now, while we still have time. Have you ever felt like you're at a crossroads? Like you need to make a decision that could change everything? Have you ever had the feeling that something inside you is calling you to be different, to seek something greater? Comment here if this message touched you in any way. Write, "I choose the light," or "There is still time," because when we share our reflections, we make space for others to awaken too. And what comes next is an even deeper calling, something that can transform your life definitively. Conclusion. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this message has deeply touched your heart. I want to invite you to reflect on everything we shared and ask yourself, how has it impacted your life? How might this experience, this story of transformation and hope, be speaking directly to you? It's no coincidence that you watched this video until the end. God has a purpose in every detail, and if you are here now, it is because He wants to speak to your heart in a special way. Leave in the comments how this video touched you. We really want to know what you felt, what went through your mind while listening to this story. Write it below. I felt God's voice in this video, and share how this message moved you. It doesn't matter if it was something small or big. Every transformation starts with one step. And who knows, your comment might also inspire other people to open up to this message. If you felt that this content brought light, comfort, or an important warning to your life, don't keep it to yourself. Support this mission by leaving a like, because each like helps this message reach more hearts that need a word of hope. And if you believe that other people can be impacted like you were, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. This way, you won't miss any of the next videos that we are preparing with so much care and dedication to bless your life. Here, each content is designed to bring transformation, spiritual awakening, and strengthen your faith. When you sign up, you are part of this mission, and together we can reach even more people around the world. And don't stop here. On the final screen, the next video is already waiting for you, full of revelations and powerful messages that can continue to transform your life. Take advantage of this moment, connect even more with God, and allow Him to continue speaking to your heart. May God bless you and your family powerfully, bringing peace, wisdom, and direction to every step you take. Remember, you are not alone. There is a greater purpose for your life, and this message is just the beginning. Thank you for being here, for opening your heart, and for being part of this journey with us. See you in the next video.